Alright, so this is the full production breakdown for Futureblind. It all began with this riff that just popped into my head. I was trying to write something catchy. This is what came out. So that was the basis of it. So started building the track from there. Yeah, so the first thing that I did was map that out in, like I start a lot of my tracks. If the original riff was a guitar riff, I'll go into Ableton and I'll map it out on a synth. And so I used a Dune patch. Dune is one of my favorite soft synths to use. It's great. I think I just flipped through and found a preset that I like. And the thing about Dune is that it doesn't matter what preset you find in it. They're all usable and wonderful. So this is it. And there's not really a lot that happens in this. There's not a lot of movement. There's just like a filter. Like what this is here is, yeah, the filter cut off from the synth itself that just opens up throughout the various choruses just to make it sound bigger and more trancey and less plucky and more saw-y, washed out kind of stuff. And then, yeah, during like the little intro sequences where it's sort of teasing that motif, the filter is a lot more closed off. And it just opens up. Beyond that, on this channel, I just had like the SSL channel strip, just cutting off the lows and some highs to make space for like the hi-hats, and then also the lower instruments, and then just like some reductive EQ just to make space for other stuff. And then I was also trying to mix it in using this Mag EQ, which has this awesome air band. It works pretty magically. You should check this thing out. So from there, once I had that built in, recorded the guitars first. And this is like I've been using this this rack in Ableton for a while for both my metal project and a lot of my electronic stuff. It's actually using the older version of the SSL channel strip. Some more reductive EQ, just because there's some resonant frequencies that are very common to the patch on the Helix that I'm using. I point down because the Helix is under my desk. This API 550 EQ, which works awesome on guitars. I like to pull out around 800 hertz a bit just because it makes room for a lot of the synthesizers and stuff like that, because the thing is about like heavy distorted guitars is it's just like a wall of frequencies and you got to poke as many holes in it as you possibly can just to make room for everything else. Sometimes if they're not cutting through the mix enough, I will boost at 5K a little bit, but didn't really need to here. They're bright enough already. Using an LA2A just to kind of level them out a little bit, even though they're already heavily compressed. And then the 1176 here is great for catching. Like it's got very fast attack and release times because it's very good at catching those errant peaks. Like stuff like this here, like when it starts playing, you'll see like there's a bit of a transient there. The 1176 just kind of catches that and makes sure it's not just like a jarring like stab in your ear for that particular section or whatever. And then once I had the leads down, then I recorded the rhythms, everything from like this wall at the beginning, which like goes along with like the big Brahm synths and like the cinematic drums, which we'll get into in a second. But the actual rhythm bits, and use the same exact chain on the rhythm guitar bus as well. Also, I have those routed out to my guitar room, or GAT room as I call it. It's just like an Ableton preset small dark room. It basically just kind of gives them all a sense of space, like all of these individually tracked guitars are multiple instruments in the same room. And then the lead guitars were also, yeah, they were recorded dry without any effects on them, but then they were routed to this, which is basically just a delay and a reverb. And I guess here I tried a couple different ones. I tried this SSL-X delay, but I couldn't dial it in quite the way that I wanted, so I used the Native Instruments Replica XT instead. Skybox is a JST plugin I picked up recently, and it's awesome. So then moving past the guitars, yeah, I think I built the drums out next, but then I also started with these cinematic drums because I figured try to make this as epic and cinematic as possible. So these are just the Native Instruments action strikes, just whatever default preset in there, running through the SSL Fusion Vintage Drive just to give them a bit more saturation, density if you will. And then into the channel strip, there's a little bit of compression and stuff happening here, just a little bit of reductive EQ to like cut out some of the muddiness and make space for other stuff in the mix. I did kind of crank up at about 100 hertz here just to give them a little more weight, but at the same time I do automate the high pass filter throughout the session. So for example, in the verses where there's a lot more stuff happening with the drums, it kind of goes up a little bit to make space for the kick. And then during the builds where there's less stuff happening, to give it more weight, it goes back down a bit. Various velocities automated there. And I also made a point to slightly offset those hits so they don't hit exactly at the same time as the kick transient, because then it just kind of gives them more weight, like so. So then on to the drum bus. What I primarily did here is I just used a whole bunch of different samples. A lot of these are from various Native Instruments, expansion packs and stuff like that, just because their sounds are awesome. I always love picking from different packs and combining them together into one cohesive kit. Oftentimes I'll just cycle through and find a whole bunch of ones that I think will work in the song and then dump them into the drum rack. A bunch of these I didn't actually end up using at all. They're just there in case. Yeah, and then I kind of went along and just programmed everything. And then for things like the kicks and whatnots, like I'll oftentimes run them through this SSL Fusion EQ just to give them a little bit more like low-end oomph. Oftentimes I find that the samples are a bit too bright, and so when I listen to them later on speakers, like it's too clicky. So I'll end up rolling off the high end, like for the main kick in the chorus. I needed to do it between the SSL Fusion and then also this Better Maker EQ, which has a really awesome attenuation circuit in it. I kind of needed the both of them to do that for me, because without, it's a bit much, but with, it's just a little bit more subdued and more controlled and stuff. I ended up, for the main snare in the chorus, I ended up layering, I believe, this snare. And then I found another snare that I increased the attack time. So it's more of just like more of the body of it. Resampled and processed it, ended up being this. And that's running through Fusion for a bit more brightness. The channel strip again, just for a bit more EQ, some more compression and stuff like that. Makes it really thick and punchy and stuff. Everything else, just various hi-hats. Might have used that, I can't remember. And then this other thing here is this trigger thing, which perfectly mirrors everything that's going on with the kick and the snares, and that is routed externally to the not drums bus, which has shaper box on it, which basically just ducks out every time a kick or a snare hit, which is a little bit of sidechain action. Beyond that, there's just like a reverse cymbal on there, which has some echo, I think, some fusion for a little bit more high end. Just a basic drum bus compressor on the whole thing. Pretty beefy. That's all routed to the drum room, which is this Native Instruments RC48 reverb plugin. It's just a preset that I've saved that I like to use on a drum room, just to make all of these sample drums sound like they're in a real room and in a real space. So it just gives everything a little bit more depth. So there's the cinematic drums. I have these impacts, which I resampled and processed a bit using the Native Instruments, was it Rise and Hit contact instrument? And there's just a few that I found that I thought would fit the sonic aesthetic of the track. And there's not really much happening there, just a fairly low high pass filter, 50 hertz, just to make a little bit of room for the sub stuff. And then on top of that, there's like all the swishes. In certain sections, there's a noise downwinder, which just has the gain automated for like that pumping effect. Pretty classic, tried and true thing. Forever riser, that just has the fade that fits the tempo in the grid. Pretty straightforward stuff. That transall lead is this end pluck, which actually just comes in because I felt like when there's that key change at the end of the song, it's just the trans saw on its own was a little bit, it just needed something above it, like an octave at least, and that's exactly what this is. So this was an Anna 2 saw patch running through an SSL channel strip mixed in. So on its own, the original saw was this. And mixed in. subtle, but it just adds a little bit more high energy to it. And there's all the bass design stuff. So I used Massive X quite a bit for all the stuff, and that's pretty much where all the bass sounds came from. There might have been like a Dune patch in there somewhere, but the initial placeholder that I used underneath the guitars was this guy. So yeah, that's just like dirty, clean, slightly modified massive preset run through Fusion, so a little bit of low end boost, even though ironically I think later I ended up high passing it pretty high to make room for the sub and stuff. Yeah, a bit of a boost in the highs just to give it a bit more grit, and yeah, so channel strip, cut the highs just to make room for hi-hats and cymbals and stuff, and then yeah, it's cut off at about 75. Yeah, and I was just automating some parameters within Massive just to give it some movement and stuff like that. So that one just happens in the choruses. The next one was this like Cyber Goat. The reason why it's named that is because that is literally the preset name. Yeah, a little bit of chorus on it just to make it a bit wider. Fairly generously high passed. And then all of these like gnar crunch samples are just resampled. Like I was flipping around through a bunch of Massive X presets and just like found some sounds that I liked and just resampled them, chopped them up, processed them, resampled again, etc., etc., and that's basically all that is. Yeah, so all that was happening during the choruses. And then this gonk thing, same thing, resampled Massive X stuff. That's why it's called gonk. I guess technically it's more of a donk, if you will, but gonk is a slang used in Cyberpunk, so it felt appropriate. That was a combination of a couple different samples that I'd resampled and processed together. Brahmin. If you're a Fallout nerd like I am, you'll know exactly what that's referring to. Weird two-headed cows, but it's a reference to Brahms, those big like brrr things you hear in movie trailers all the time. Yeah, that was another Massive X thing, and during a couple of those I'm just ever so slightly bending the pitch of it up like barely a semitone just to give it that unnerving sort of tension. And this down womp, from what I recall, this only happens like twice, but it's the same Cyber Goat patch as before, just modified a little bit differently. And all I'm doing here is I'm narrowing the stereo width right before the drop, like the final drop where it goes all drum and bassy, and I'm narrowing it to make the contrast of the drop sound wider, and then bringing up the level as well because I wanted it to kind of like fade in from the background while automating the filter cutoff. And then just once again running through a channel strip just for filters and stuff, but it's this. And then same with that other bit later. These disto swells and all these various these are also resampled, I think, for Massive X. There's a little bit of movement with like auto pan and stuff. So as the verses get busier, there's more stuff like that comes in just to add more atmosphere. There's like this little crunch sequence, which is another resampled Massive X thing. And same with this metal pad thing, which sounds really hypnotic with, if we go back up here to the basses for a minute, this was also another Massive X patch that I found, but like it just sounded something that you would hear in the game. Like I swear I've heard that same like dung 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 thing like in various levels and stuff. And layered with that metal pad, it just sounds super hypnotic and it just kind of takes you out of it for a second. I really dug that combination for some reason, so that's why there's like a whole miniature section dedicated to it. There's this vintage pad using an Arturia. It was one of the V collection synths, just a Prophet, because we all know the Prophet series synths to be associated with the Blade Runner soundtrack and stuff, which is like the OG cyberpunk dystopian sci-fi future type thing. Yeah, I was looking for something that had that kind of sound. That's just running through a channel strip again. It just has a little bit of sidechain pumping to it. And then I also use a Centauri's. Normally it's like a vocal doubler, but I just wanted to make it a little bit wider and kind of more washed out, which is very characteristic of like vintage synths. So without the pumping, it just sounds like this. Yeah, and then I guess the other final little synthy bit is that at the very end, like, it just needed to have more energy above the key change. So I added this like other ana patch, just more saws to combine with the end bit. Later, once I had to do the vocals in a separate session, which I'll also get into in a little bit, but these are just the imported stems from that vocal session, which is just the combined, the growls, the spoken vocals, the wet effects, the clean sung vocals, and then I guess like all the other like little vocoder things and stuff like that, but get into that in a sec. Yeah, essentially that's kind of the whole session. Obviously, honorable mention the sub, which like I'll oftentimes split the basses in the song. I'll have like, as you can see here, this bus called mid basses, which is all of those gritty basses and samples and just all of the textural stuff. And then there's just the sub, which is this chain I've been using for the last couple of years, like a very heavily compressed serum sub patch. All right, so here we are in the vocal session. I figured it would make the most sense just to start a separate session to record the vocals, just because there's a lot of vocal processing that goes into the stuff, and in order to take the load off of an already very computationally busy session with all the instrumental stuff going on, I figured it makes sense just to start a separate thing, process all the vocal stuff on their own, and then just export the stems, load them back into the previous session. Just made sense. So I bounced out just a rough mix at whatever I had at the time and just recorded over it. I went to a very, very remote location. It's purely out of necessity, just because right behind me here there is a fridge that turns on every 30 some minutes, runs for 15, turns off again, etc. Also, this is a shared studio space, so in order not to disturb my partner and also just be completely focused in the moment on the vocal stuff, it just made sense to do that. So set up the mic in there and off I went. So what's going on here is it's kind of divvied up into sections. So I have the spoken stuff, which is a combination of spoken word and whispers. Now there's the growlies, some clean vocals, and then the vocoded effects. I started with recording the spoken vocals, and if I open up the take lanes here, you'll notice there's take after take after take after take. Once I finished recording everything, I went phrase by phrase, cut out the ones that fit what I had in mind the most, compiled them all into one master thing, and then ultimately exported them into a spoken word track and then a whisper track. So in terms of the layering, I had the one main spoken track, then there's a double, both are panned to the center, and then later in the second verse I had two doubles panned hard left and right, and then conversely for the whisper stuff, I had, while the main spoken parts were going on, they were panned center, and then I had the whisper stuff panned hard left and right, and then later during the second verse I panned the one of them just to the center while the other spoken bits were panned hard left and right. So it was kind of like a flipped contrast in a way. On the whisper stuff, I just added a channel strip with a pretty high pass filter, also low pass as well, and that's important to do with vocal stacking, just because the more layers you have, the less you want of the building up of consonants and stuff, because then you have a lot of sibilance that builds up. So if you listen to any of the backing like harmonies or the whisper stuff here or what have you on its own, it sounds kind of dull, but together in context with the lead, it sounds nice and full without being overly sibilant or harsh or whatever. Again, with the mixing, there's like the channel strip, and then I had the mag EQ, adding a little bit more air to the whisper stuff. The spoken vocals, the lead had some compression on it, a little bit of reductive EQ as well. The double had that Antares vocal doubler thing, and pretty much the same settings, just I think a little bit more of an aggressive low pass filter. And then once that was all done, I ran it, the combination of them, through this vintage drive just for a bit more drive intensity. This Better Maker I think I used literally just for the high pass at 100, the mag EQ for air, the 1176 and the 2A in combination, which is a very classic combo. So the 1176 being a much faster compressor will clamp down on the transients like the consonants and things like that, and the LA2A will level out the body of the vocal, and together they just make everything nice and consistent. And then once that was all dialed in, rendered that to this track, which is a sum of everything, and then same with the whispers, rendered them out to their own track here as well. So, and then applied further processing to the both of them together, which ended up being just a bus compressor just to glue everything, a de-esser for obvious reasons. This decapitator here is giving it that kind of old radio voice effect. I slightly tweaked this preset to fit the mix without it on. It sounds like this.
Digital spirits beckon from beyond, a tattered veil of obsidian, outcast the eye with and midst this fragile haven of humanity.
And with it,
Piercing talons ever probe for weakness, seeking to find a means of ingress.
The whispers on their own, the full stereo type thing. With the spoken vocals.
I within Mitzi, this fragile haven of humanity.
Without the whispers.
Piercing talons ever probe for weakness, seeking to find a means of ingress.
So, spoken word on their own.
We must transcend the limits physical. Civilization's fall is inevitable. The fools who cling to hope are out of time, succumbing to their fate, their future blind.
So the whispers just add like a nice textural sort of creepy whispery type thing. As well, it's worth noting that I had to go in and do like quite a lot of edits to the vocals. On every track that wasn't the lead, I had to cut out the breaths in between, like the phrasing and everything else, because you also don't want a bunch of building up, right? Same with certain consonants, like I ended up cutting out like here. And like that, it just ended up with the music and everything else. It was just like too distracting. There's just like too much stuff going on. So like, yeah, I had to be very precise about cutting stuff like that out. And both the spoken stuff as well as the growly stuff later is also fed through a separate reverb send as well as a delay send. So on the reverb send, I have this isotope neoverb, which is a really cool verb. It has 3 verbs in one actually. So there's like a room, a plate, and a hall, and you can kind of dial in the balance between them all, which is a lot more convenient than having 3 separate reverb sends. And then I have smooth operator here, and it's actually sidechained to the input of the total vocal bus. So what happens is whenever the vocals are playing,
and a tattered veil of obsidian.
It's very slightly ducking out those specific frequencies. So there's no clash between the verb and the vocals, between the dry and the wet signal, right? So as soon as the vocals stop, the reverb comes in full force. And when the vocals are going, it ducks out just a little bit to make space. So there's no like washing out or anything like that, which is a very handy thing. And the same thing was on the delay send. And on the delay send, I just have this SSLX delay, just a very basic 8-note delay, pan to the center, a little bit wider, not like super wide, just somewhere in between the center and full width, bit of saturation, some diffusion to kind of give it a bit of space kind of thing, a bit more saturation just to make it cut through the mix a bit more so it doesn't get completely buried, and just some reductive EQ. Some frequencies were beginning to build up. Yeah, so it's the spoken stuff. Onto the growly. So same thing. It was center lead vocal, the doubled vocal with an isotope vocal doubler, which is very similar to that Antares one, just kind of a different flavor to give it more width. And then I had the backup stuff on their own little group, but they had this Soundtoys little radiator saturator on there just to give them a little bit more grit and distortion and stuff, which glued them together but also give them thickness and stuff. Those are panned to varying degrees of left and right, fairly moderate as far as width, with the exception of these guys here, which come in at the very end. Prepare yourself, because growly sound very cheesy on their own. So when that last phrase goes in, like as their essence fades into nothingness, we learned that we were the future blind. Just to add emphasis to that, gave a little bit more width with this.
We were the future blind.
But of course with everything.
Nothingness, we learned that we were the future blind.
Without compression and saturation and everything else, growlies can sound pretty cheeseball. It's without all the processing, but so same thing. Quite a few takes of each track, and then I comp them all together. This is a more obvious example of where I'm cutting out all of the breaths and stuff like that in between the phrasing. So the only track that actually has it is the lead. Everything else is just there to support it. So the growlies also have a pretty hefty high cut filter on them. Yeah, so each one would have a cell channel strip with a bunch of compression, reductive EQ, saturation. That was just on the lead vocal and the doubler. Yeah, the other ones didn't have it. Some more EQ. And then all together, they were all fed through the black box tube saturator for more grit and weight. This HF compressor, you can use it either as a de-esser or just something to kind of help smooth out some of the harsher frequencies, which with growlies, there tends to be an issue with some like gargly throat gack that bleeds into the mic, which is why dynamic microphones are most often used for this kind of vocal style. Condensers tend to be a little bit too bright and brittle and harsh sounding. And yeah, after that, the 76 and the 2A, again, the de-esser, obviously. I guess I ended up using another HF compressor just to give it a little bit more control. And then, yeah, just a little bit of extra filtering after all that saturation and everything else. Bounced out the growlies to their own summed channel, and then to that, applied even more processing. So this SSLX EQ, just to help control some of the frequencies that were building up and muddying up the mix and stuff. Another de-esser, parallel mixed somewhat, another mag EQ for air. This Normally I would use a reverb as a send, but in this case I used it right on the thing just because with this mix knob I could control exactly how much. Like I was using it for some throws just in the rebuild section where it's going like demise, demise, arise, we'll rise. Case in point.
Demise! Demise! Arise!
Yeah, so there's that. And then I have these kind of creative effects like erosion, pitch shifter. Utility, I was just controlling a little bit of, like there are some small decibel and a half adjustments like in some of the verses. Like I just wanted the growlies not to be as loud as the chorus, for example. So there's that section a little bit quieter, and then it goes up by decibel when the chorus hits. In the early section of the track, like where the line goes, they will watch as our doom unfolds. There's a little bit of this erosion, bit reduction stuff that happens.
As our doom unfolds!
And then during that build at the end, there's a combination of the pitch being shifted up as well as the erosion kind of crushing the bits downward, like so.
We will rise!
So subtle stuff. It gets a little bit buried in the mix, but it still gave it a little bit more texture and movement and stuff. And then as well, what I did was I took the vowel from Arise, where it goes, rah, copied that further in the track, cranked up that skybox reverb, resampled it, and then reversed it to get this kind of breath effect, which is injected at various parts of the track to kind of give a bit of a sucking in breath movement right before the vocals hit, just to ease with the transitions. Then I did this clean vocal bit. So what this is for is like, it's very subtle. You can't really hear it in the mix, but if it were to go away, you would definitely notice it. But what it does is it adds some melodic weight to the growlies, because the growlies are very atonal. At first I tried recording them with like voice behind them, but because I was admittedly very out of practice, like I haven't done growlies in a while, and it took like about a week worth of practice for my throat to kind of get used to it again. So I had to re-record a bunch of it a few times. And first I tried adding pitched vocals with the growlies, and just wasn't working out. It's very hard for a program like Melodyne to like latch on to growly vocals that have all of this like atonal textural stuff going on, and it just ends up adding a whole bunch of artifacts and it sounds really weird. So I just scrapped that, re-recorded them again without any voice behind them, and then just separately recorded a clean vocal take, and then mixed that in with them to kind of give them some melodic weight. So on their own, right, if we go to the chorus, sound like this.
We will leave this world behind!
But if you mix them with the clean,
we will leave this world behind, for its end is nigh!
So that clean track on its own sounds like this.
We will leave this world behind, for its end is nigh.
So what went into that was a comped vocal track, melodined, just because I'm far from a perfect singer and I don't have perfect pitch, but close enough, I guess, and then just fine tweak it after the fact. So I used Nectar to kind of give it width and more voices. So what the cool thing about Nectar is, aside from the vocal assistant thing where it can kind of help you auto mix it, add some EQ, compression, whatever, DS it, just helps speed things up a little bit. But you can also do this harmony thing where you can take that same voice and duplicate it within the plugin and pitch it by varying intervals, so octaves and thirds and fifths and what have you. So without it on its own, sounds like this.
Separate your consciousness and digitize your mind.
And with it,
Separate your consciousness and digitize your mind.
it's pretty neat. And then channel strip, pretty aggressive, low pass filter and stuff, and just a little bit of volume automation for certain parts. And then finally, the cool thing, so this vocoder track was actually made using the Arturia vocoder. It's been a really long time since I mucked around with vocoders. Never really done too much stuff with them, but essentially how this works is I took the spoken vocal track, routed it out to the vocoder, and you can either play this with a keyboard or I just programmed in a MIDI note, just the root note of the song. And then as I was recording, like I was just resampling everything live, I would just muck around with all these different settings, right? So
digital spirits back from beyond, a tattered veil of obsidian. Podcast AI with enmity, this fragile haven of humanity.
Stuff like that. So you ended up with like these cool textural things that would emphasize certain phrases during the verse.
This fragile haven of humanity.
And then, the cooler bits were during the second verse.
Echo from beyond, with promises of oblivion. Till stop at nothing to bring our demise.
Originally, I had these takes, which sounded really cool and very creepy, like this.
Did you listen to echo from beyond, with promises of oblivion? Stop at nothing to bring our demise.
and that was really neat. But what I found is that it was a little bit too jarring in the context of everything else, and so I just re-recorded it with a different set of settings and ended up with what it is now. And then once everything was mixed, I basically just bounced it all out into individual stems, ported them back into the mix session. I had to do a little bit more de-essing on the growlies just because within the context of the mix, it's still a little bit harsh. But other than that, everything else remained unchanged, and then just exported that out into the master session, and there it was. After having done the final little mix tweaks and micro adjustments to the whole thing, bounced them out here. Not a lot going on. So I usually start with the Oxford inflator, which it's black magic. Nobody really knows how it works except the people that built it. But what it is, it gives you perceived loudness without actually changing the loudness. Like, it doesn't affect the dynamics necessarily. It's just like, it just makes things fatter and fuller sounding. It's great. Then I have the BX Digital EQ used in mid side. So what I'll do is I'll roll off at about 20 to 30 hertz in the mid channel just to clean up some like the low end muck on both the side and mid channels. I'll roll off at about 24 to 30k to clean up the extraneous high GAC. I will high pass a little bit higher, like somewhere between 90 to 150 hertz on the sides, just to narrow things down a little bit more. The cool thing about this plugin is it also has a mono maker setting, which will make everything below a certain frequency mono, which, also handy for tightening up the bass and stuff like that. Just some very small micro adjustments across some frequencies that are building up a bit and sounding a bit harsh. Some dynamic EQ to also tame some harshness and build up in certain regions. Next, going through a saturator plugin, mid-side version of the black box. It was applying more saturation to the sides just because I wanted to give the illusion of width, and saturating the sides a little more in the middle will do that. This K clip, that's really wicked clipper that just helps shave off some of like the really unruly transients in the mix before they hit a compressor or your limiter or whatever else, and you can dial it in very precisely. You can also use this delta function to listen only to the audio that it's shaving off to make sure that you're not like a little bit too generous with the shaving. Then the Elysia alpha compressor, very small ratio, like 1.5, very gentle compressor just to glue everything together. It was maybe doing like a decibel to decibel and a half of reduction, so not a lot at all. This dangerous back CQ, in order to get the mix to where I wanted to, like I felt I needed to drop down a shelf around like 2k, and in order to add to the width a little bit more, boosted 1.5 decibels, around 7, pretty wide subtle shelf, and then finally just going into the Ozone 10 maximizer. This was also not really doing that much. The mix is already pretty loud, pretty controlled, and that's kind of the gist of it. I mean, I was using some metering plugs like tonal balance control, just try to keep everything within this region roughly, levels, just to make sure I was in the right loudness. This adapter streamliner is a really cool plugin because it lets you preview what your master will sound like through all of these different platforms and their various quality tiers. I find it's a good tool just to make sure that there's not going to be like undue distortion, or if it's not going to sound weird, to a limit. Obviously, if you have something at like a very low quality, like if someone's listening on a crappy speaker with very low quality, you can't do anything about that, and they're not going to notice much of a difference anyway. And I mixed and mastered everything using these headphones, using the Slate VSX plugin for monitoring and stuff. And once everything was dialed in, just bounced out the full mix and the instrumental version, and that's pretty much the tune. And I hope you really dug it, and hopefully you got something out of this. And as per always, thanks so much for watching, being here, for listening, and hopefully we'll chat soon.